Hi, everyone. Welcome to Making It Stick, a practical approach to dissemination and implementation. We're excited to have you join us for the second part of our series. My name is Rochelle Espiritu, and I'm joined by our group of presenters here, Heather, Scott, Molly, Jonathan, and we're supported by Felicia today. So thank you for joining us. We are going to go ahead and get started with our language slide, which is the first one. Felicia, if you can move us onto that one, and then we'll give you the community builder. So many of you have already seen this slide, but a good reminder for all of us to know that we're using affirming and respectful and recovery-oriented language that is strength-based and hopeful, that we're inclusive of our many different life experiences and identities in this room, that we're healing-centered and trauma responsive, and then definitely looking at meeting people where we all are in our different journeys, and that we're trying to be respectful, clear, and understandable. Just wanted to highlight a few. So we will go on to our welcome slide. And we'd love for you to all introduce yourselves in the chat. We know that we have colleagues from all across the nation and the territories and the jurisdictions. So please share your name, your pronouns, if you're comfortable sharing those, which center and network you are with, and knowing that we were excited to be able to offer this opportunity to the MHTTCs, the PTTCs, and the ATTCs. So we welcome all of our colleagues from the different networks and where you're located. And we thought it'd be kind of fun to hear a little bit about what your dream job might be if you weren't involved in this network. So if money was not an object or location was not an object, what would you be doing right now? And I'll just share verbally that if I could be doing anything, I'd actually be an adventure like travel guide, so that I could be going all across the world and finding really cool places to be in, and getting to learn more about those settings. So if you'd like to share a little bit about what you'd be doing, that would be great. I think it gives us a different glimpse into our colleagues and what they'd like to do. And I've got a co-adventure tour guide already, Megan. Thanks for sharing that. And I forgot to introduce Joni, who is also presenting with us today. And we're so grateful that she has agreed to be here and share her example from her work as well. So thank you, everyone. Ooh, and a winemaker. We've got a history museum curator. These are great. Coffee shop owner or event planner, a pilot. We could be a great group of colleagues, like creating all kinds of neat things here. So great. Thank you for sharing. And please continue to add in that information into the chat as well. All right, so we can go on to the next slide, Felicia. Just want to do a little bit of a recap from what we talked about last time, especially if you weren't on the call with us last week. We're glad that you can join us this week. We are trying to build on each of the sessions in this learning series. So just as a quick recap, last time we talked about different dissemination and implementation models. We presented, or Heather actually presented a lot on the EPIS model, which suggests that any implementation of a new innovation or evidence-based practice has these 4 different stages or phases, which you can see on the screen. The first really being around exploration, which involves that awareness of what the needs are, either through your clients or the community, and thinking about what the change might be in terms of the practice, which might include a decision to then adopt a new practice. The preparation being that time that it takes to get ready for implementation. It might include things like staff training or building a community coalition or changing different kinds of protocols or policies that are in existence in your organizations. And then implementation is that taking that step forward, beginning to use or use that new practice or provide it. And then sustainment really being like, how do you make sure things are sticking? Delivering it with fidelity and making sure that the practice is being maintained over time. So we know that these practices are really helpful in setting expectations for both clinical staff as well as program staff and leaders. And when you're getting ready to implement new projects, it's really helpful to outline what those different stages or phases of change are. It helps people to understand what to expect as part of the work. It's also nice to think about the other model that we talked briefly about was Fix-It and Blase's stage model that breaks it down from kind of that initial exploration all the way into full implementation. So recognizing that organizations go through that kind of growth as well, thinking about that kind of awkward teenager phase where you're like, think you know what you're doing, but you really don't, all the way into full implementation where programs should be kind of humming along and moving smoothly. So those were some of the key points to think about as you're thinking about implementation. We'll go on to the next slide so we can share a little bit about what to expect for today's session. So in today's session, we're going to be talking about the how to do it then. So previously it was the what, now we're talking about how. We're going to go over 4 different types of D&I frameworks and concepts that can help you think about how to make your work more effective. And that'll be this focus in session 2 around what some of the engagement and context is for implementation, what some of those barriers and facilitators might be as you're exploring your work, and what some of the implementation strategies are. So thanks for continuing to introduce yourselves. If you're just joining us, you might be getting a sense that we've asked you to introduce yourself, your location, which center or network you're with, and what your dream job might be if money wasn't an object or location wasn't an object. So please continue to introduce yourselves into the chat. And I will go ahead and turn it now over to Molly.
All right, next slide. So one of the first challenges that we are frequently faced with is trying to decide who do we engage in our intensive TA work. And sometimes it's helpful to learn from our mistakes. So I am here to offer up some personal mistakes that I have made or that we have made over time that I think there's some lessons to. Chances are you may have had some similar experiences, so see if any of these resonate for you. Okay, so here's one example. It's the beginning of a workshop. You ask participants, what do they hope to get out of the training? And what they tell you is that they're not sure why they're here. Perhaps they had a supervisor tell them to show up. They don't really have any idea about how this particular practice is expected to be rolled out within the organization. I know I've had that experience. Here's another one. You or the trainer comes in and they describe sort of those core components of the practice that need to be in place in order to be effective. And you find out that the individual trainee's organization perhaps has some strict rules in place, some policies or so forth that really don't allow for the practice to be implemented as it's intended. So in this case, soon after the trainer begins sharing information, all that trainee can think about is, this isn't going to work for me. It's just not going to work in my environment. Another lesson has been one where the providers get trained in the practice, but perhaps the organization isn't really ready to take referrals for it or to really truly implement it for several additional months, let's say 5 months later. And so those providers who are newly trained and excited about that new intervention and ready to practice don't actually have anybody there for them to use those new skills with. And we all know that as time goes by, it becomes harder and harder to take those skills that you learn and truly implement them. So our timing is off. Another lesson, you start with an intensive cohort of 15 providers. You're really doing a lot of follow-up coaching over time to really make sure those skills stick and that people are prepared to use this in their everyday work. And 6 months into your implementation, you find out you've really dwindled down to just about 3 providers left, right? The other folks have been promoted to new positions in the organization. They're no longer providing that service, or perhaps they've even left the agency. So whereas we started off with a great cohort of folks, we're just down to a few by the time we're further into the implementation. And then my last example is one where providers realize that they've come to the training, but they don't actually have access to the materials or perhaps to some technology that's needed for them to do the intervention itself. And they're not sure how they're going to have access to that. All of those are things that I've experienced, and they're all things that perhaps with some better engagement and planning at the beginning could have been prevented. We can't prevent everything, all of the lessons learned from happening, right? Mistakes will happen, but we do want to do some things to try and make sure that we're investing our intensive TA resources wisely. So let's look at some strategies and talk about some strategies that we can use to engage participants in our intensive TA. And let's think about our engagement strategies at really both the organizational and the individual levels. So next slide. First, let's start thinking about it at the organizational level. So if you think back to the EPIS model and those first two stages of exploration and preparation that we talked about at the last meeting, we know that that's really important. It's an important part of the process to make sure that things that we're able to implement as we expect. So one strategy that we can use is to engage with an organization, gather the ideal members of an implementation team, and then work through those stages with them. Engage in that exploration stage, engage in the preparation phases, so we make sure that that organization is fully prepared for implementation. And that's really the ideal way that we want to do it when we can. However, we know that isn't necessarily always the reality for how we are able to work with people. We may end up with multiple organizations that are at different levels, et cetera. And so we may have to think about other ways that we can also make sure we're engaging organizations at the right time. So what are some of the other ways that we can do that? One strategy is to require an organizational application, and to have that application include questions that help you get at that readiness and that commitment to implementation. The NCO has some examples of applications that others have used and that can perhaps help you get some ideas. Frequently, what we do is we ask the applicant organization to help us understand their plan for implementation. So depending on the practice, we might ask a variety of different questions about who they intend to provide the service and what capacity, what the supports are, et cetera. So we understand whether or not they do have a plan and how well thought out that plan is. And that's a part of our selection process. Another option might be to measure the readiness of the organization itself by conducting a survey, perhaps of staff within that organization, and using that as a part of the basis for understanding who you might want to involve in the training and TA. You can also have the organization provide information about policies and funding and other things like that that are important to the practice, and then engage early in diagnosing any challenges as a part of that preparation and engagement. And the last one that I want to share, one of the issues that we've spent a lot of time discussing is whether or not an organization needs to demonstrate a willingness to commit some financial resources to the implementation, even if it's a small one. We do have the privilege really of offering free training, free support, and TA. And sometimes that commitment becomes a little bit harder to assess because of that. So for example, we have sometimes asked organizations to commit to training a certain number of people in order to participate in a train the trainer workshop, basically asking them to have some resources that they are putting into it as well after we've invested resources in their development. So let's look next at how we ensure we are engaging the right individuals in our TA. Next slide. Okay, so in the same way that we thought about an application at an organizational level, we might also want to have an application to identify the right providers to participate in the training. We, of course, want to consider obvious things like, do they have the right credentials to deliver the practice? But we may also want to consider other factors that would be important to our engagement of individuals. Perhaps their beliefs about evidence-based practices or their beliefs about that particular practice. You can also try to think strategically about who you want to engage. Even once you've had an organization identified, who do you want to engage as those initial providers that you're going to focus your intensive TA on? Perhaps engaging some people that are opinion leaders in the organization. Even sometimes engaging those people that can sometimes be naysayers. If you can get them on board and really get them excited about the practice, that can do a large amount to shift opinion within an organization. We found that it's a good idea to select more than one provider at a particular organization. So sometimes we will look to identify providers that are coming in multiples, because that gives them a colleague to bounce ideas off of. It gives them somebody to hold the other person accountable for really implementing within that organization. And it shows additional commitment from the organization itself. And then another strategy that can be helpful to really build readiness is to give individuals who are going to participate some pre-work. Help them engage in the activities ahead of the training, such as having them participate in an online training module that really gets them kind of accustomed to the information, ready for that initial training. But it also has the potential benefit sometimes of eliminating individuals who are not going to be as committed to the training. If you've got a few steps that you have to do at first, you will actually probably lose a few people who maybe were not quite ready to undertake the next steps. You can also survey the individuals to better understand their readiness. And that can be really useful in allowing your trainers to adjust the training to the providers and their level of readiness, potentially even offering different tracks for different individuals at different levels of readiness. So let's say, for example, that you are going to provide a training in a CBT intervention for psychosis. You may have some participants who have a lot of different skills in CBT, but they just haven't been trained in applying those skills to psychosis. But then you might also have other participants who have very little experience with CBT approaches at all, right? It's all new to them. So you might end up offering a beginner track to those that need to build some of that readiness, and then also an advanced track for those who are further along. Another strategy is to use intentional approaches to try and enhance engagement. For example, providing individuals with a certificate after they have successfully mastered a particular practice can be a way to really enhance engagement. Or even better yet, if you're able to have an organization offer a pay increase, or even a state level offer additional reimbursement for providers who have implemented high fidelity practice, that really helps build some of that engagement. And then another idea just to share for engaging individuals is to create a bit of a staged training process that allows you to identify those participants who are best suited to participate in the intensive TA. So I have a quick example of that on the next slide. So one of the things that we were interested in doing is providing some intensive TA around an evidence-based practice that was focused on provider wellness. It's called SMART. And we wanted to offer about a 6-month trainer certification. So we knew it was going to be pretty intensive, and it was going to be really important that we engage the right people and build some readiness, but this was not a practice that had been used within the region. So we decided to start off by offering a tier 1 webinar to as large of an audience as we could get there. We wanted to expose as many people as possible to the model and just build some excitement. The next thing we did was we offered a series of workshops in the practice that were led by the developer. So this allowed providers to participate in that full training to really understand the model. We had a smaller group there than we did in tier 1. And then at the end of the workshops, we highlighted the opportunity to become a certified trainer. And we used an application process to select the best organizations and then individuals to participate. All right, so now we're gonna turn back to our motivational interviewing example. And Joni.
Great, thank you, Molly. As I describe the project, be listening for what strategies we used for this project. We marketed the project through our mailing list. So we sent out an overview of some of the details of the project, gave potential applicants a basic understanding of what their expectations might be. So we had them fill out an application, and some of the questions that were included were, one example was, please summarize your agency's needs regarding the implementation of motivational interviewing in your agency, so we could get a sense of what their needs were. Please describe your expectations regarding your agency's participation in the MI project. We also, as we were getting the applications in, we were looking, and we had initially developed some criteria for eligibility, and providers were made aware of that in our kind of overview and application materials. And some of that eligibility criteria was mentioned by Molly, kind of looking at the behavioral health organization wants to integrate MI into all aspects of their service delivery. So we were hoping that the MI project would really kind of be part of the entire organization. The Behavioral Health Center organization also had to commit to that implementation team that Molly talked about. We wanted to have at least 2 senior administrators, at least 3 to 5 clinical supervisors. If you were here last week, I had mentioned that we worked with 3 levels of the organization pretty intensively: administrators, supervisors, and also direct service staff. And we wanted each organization to identify at least 15 to 20 direct service staff to develop the necessary skills to implement MI. So those were some of the criteria that we used when we were looking through our applications to make sure that organizations met the criteria. We also met with individuals from the organization, and I had a brief telephone call or email, just kind of letting them know that they were accepted, and just kind of answered some of those initial questions. But then we scheduled a more intensive needs assessment, or a more intensive kind of readiness discussion. And during that time, at least 2 of us were either in person or via Zoom, meeting with organizations, the representative that we identified that you needed to have kind of 1 contact person, 1 representative, the administrative team, clinical supervisors, as well as direct service staff. So we wanted that meeting to kind of involve the entire kind of organization if possible. Of course, not everyone from the organization attended, but some of the questions that we asked during that initial face-to-face meeting, what have you done so far to introduce the motivational interviewing initiative so far? So what has the organization been doing to kind of get staff, like Molly mentioned, excited and thinking about the project? Some of the responses were, they talked about it in management meetings, within their directors meetings, and so on. We talked about barriers to be successful. So what specific barriers to the successful implementation do they anticipate? What prompted their decision to apply for participating in this project? What challenges do they think motivational interviewing will address within their agency? These are just some examples of the types of questions that we were asking during that initial meeting. We also asked questions about training. What types of training does your staff already, what training do they already have? Many of the administrators in most of the organizations and some of the clinical supervisors had some fairly recent training in motivational interviewing. Staff had not. The more direct service staff, because of the turnover, really, they would receive some training, turnover, and so on. So those were some of the examples of some of the kind of readiness questions that we asked. We'll talk a little bit further as we talk about strategies and barriers and facilitators. But for now, that's kind of where I'll end our recruitment and marketing. Again, sending out the call for applications with a fairly extensive overview of what the project involved, so that administrators had an awareness of kind of what their commitment would be, so that they, when they're applying for it, they already somewhat knew of what was to be expected of them. So I think we're going to go into a breakout room to talk a little bit further about some of these examples. So I'll send that over to John, I think.
Scott, thank you,
Scott,
Joni,
yes.
very much.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that. Great. Yeah, we're gonna, the 32 of us or so, we're gonna head into breakout rooms. Felicia's gonna take us there. And as soon as you get in, us that are leading this, we're gonna try to divide up. So, we're happy to lead the conversation. But if you find yourself without one of this, if you could choose a volunteer leader timekeeper, and then also someone else to just jot a few notes and for a report out. We'll do that when we come back together. Like Joni mentioned, this quick little breakout session, we wanted you to look at a couple things here. One is taking into account how her project and how they engage their audience. What's your personal experience? What does your TTC do that might be similar or different to what Joni's group was doing in terms of engaging their audience? And then we'd love for you to share, is there one thing in your engagement toolbox that's a must-have for you, and why is that? So those are 2 questions. I'll put those in the chat and you can refer back to those, and we'll have 10 minutes. Felicia will give you a little warning, and then we'll come back to the big room for a report out. All right, thank you. All right, welcome back, everyone. Say, if you would, start typing in the chat some of those, your must-have engagement tools. We'd love to capture that and share that as a resource. And while you're doing that, if there's 1 or 2 folks that'd be willing to just share with all of us what you heard, what were some of the strategies that came up? Anyone? Any reporter willing to share real quick?
I can share. This is Shelby Johnson from
Thank you,
Mid-America MHTTC. And we just talked about how some of our centers do indeed do applications that set the criteria. I know also at our center, as a part of that application, we do ask participants to sign off on their commitment to the time necessary. So letting them know you will be expected to meet once a month for this many hours, and you're expected to turn your cameras on and engage and talk and chat, and getting them to sign off there. And then we also talked about identifying who a champion is within an agency, someone that has a high level of influence to impact change, and kind of getting that person on board.
Fantastic. Yeah, the clear expectation, and I'm seeing in the chat too, so many folks putting in that leadership buy-in and high-level support. That's great. Thank you all very much for doing that. So I'm going to pass it on to Jonathan right now for our next steps.
All right, thank you, Scott. Yeah, I'm John Olson from the Northwest MHTTC in Region 10. And let's go to that. Yeah, a couple slides. There we go. Perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit for about 10 minutes or so on context and how we need to consider context when we're doing dissemination and implementation work. So I'll draw a little bit from some implementation science models and whatnot, but let's begin with this first slide, which just kind of gives a basic overview of what we're talking about when we think about context. I'm guessing most of you have seen a graphic similar to this. Anytime we're talking some kind of ecological model or something, we have this bullseye looking model where we have the individuals, who in our case would be our workforce members, embedded within a few different levels, right? Embedded within the organizations, what we might call the inner settings or inner contexts. These are kind of the agencies in which people are embedded. And then they're embedded within larger systems, the outer setting or the outer context. So I'm going to give a practical example, hopefully a fun example. Let's go to the next slide and apply these high-level ideas to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, this fictional world that Mr. Rogers has created. For some of you in my age or so might remember Mr. Rogers fondly as something you looked at. For some of those of you who might not be as familiar with Mr. Rogers, you'll get a little introduction on these next couple slides. So hopefully this will be a little bit of fun. Let's go to the next slide and talk about these ideas of individual, organization, and system level. So the individuals in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Okay, so for those of you unfamiliar, Mr. Rogers has a show where he's trying to engage young children in his kind of friendly set of neighbors in his make-believe setting. So he's got a whole host of individuals that do this work with him, right? You've got Mr. Rogers himself. You've got, for those of you that know the characters, the McFeelys over there on the right side. You've got Officer Clemens, Chef Brockett, all of these people that are doing this work, these friendly neighbors who are committed to helping children learn and gain positive experiences. Now, if we go to the next slide, all these individuals in turn are embedded within inner settings, right? So that's that next piece of that kind of ecological model that we look at. Those of you that are familiar with Mr. Rogers will recognize his set here. And, you know, he's got this wonderful house that is where the show takes place, and also has this land of make-believe where he does a lot of work with kids. And it's a well-resourced inner setting, right? He's got numerous props. He's got puppets. He's got his trolley. There's an aquarium in his regular house. He's got enough cardigan sweaters to take him through probably months of programming to make this a nice, warm, welcoming place for children to enter his fictional world. Okay, so those are the inner settings. Next slide, we talk about the outer settings. This nice, cozy little house is embedded within Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, right? So his neighborhood is also equally well-resourced. He has museums, he has a bakery and shops. If you look at the background here, we have streets that are well-maintained, sidewalks, parks, right? So Mr. Rogers is embedded within these different settings that seem to be very supportive, very well-resourced, and really help promote the work that he's trying to do. Now, in reality, that's not always the case for the work we do, right? So let's take the next slide and we can apply some of these ideas to TTCs. I think the analogy is pretty self-explanatory, but if we look at the individuals, who are the individuals we're trying to reach? It's the members of the workforce, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, right? And a lot of this mirrors some of the things that Molly was talking about earlier as well, in terms of looking at these different levels. So we have the individual members of the workforce. These are the people we train and we support, and they're embedded within their own inner settings, right? So Mr. Rogers and his crew, his individuals are embedded within their settings. Our people are embedded in their own settings, right? They have their organizations, the agencies where they actually work, and all of these agencies and these organizations have their own cultures, their climates, leadership styles, resources. We've already hit on some of these things today. A little bit earlier. So there are different stages in readiness for change. They're also embedded in their outer settings, these agencies. So the outer settings, typical examples include financing structures, policies, public attitudes, all these outer setting factors that influence the work that the people who we are training, who we are working with, who we are supporting, the settings. And there's bidirectional influences across all of these. So let's go to the next slide. To take it for this session, we're keeping it pretty high level. This, DNI 101, but I'd be remiss to not mention actually a couple of implementation models. When we're talking about context, you really can't avoid talking about the CFR, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. It's been put forth by Laura Damschroeder and her team. Very quickly, without getting into the weeds too much here, we're all trying to aim for those outcomes on the far right. So our team, we're talking about outcomes for youth and families. There might be adults, others that you're aiming for. To get outcomes, we need to be doing work that is of high quality, right? And that's really the focus of our session today. Actually this whole series is talking about dissemination and implementation, having success, having high fidelity, having high quality implementation outcomes. So according to Damschroeder's model, to get to that high quality implementation, we have a set of processes, and those processes that kind of cut across the bottom of this diagram are supported by those various things that I've already talked about: the outer settings or systems, contexts, the inner settings, the individuals, the teams, and then also this model talks about the characteristics of particular interventions or strategies, right? So if we have a prevention strategy or a particular a mental health intervention or whatever that we might be implementing, they have their own characteristics. They might be expensive, they might be difficult to implement. So those pieces also are going to influence the degree to which we can support high quality implementation. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go over this one very quickly. This is the EPIS model we've already talked about, but I just wanted to add an extra layer to show that the EPIS model itself also takes into account context. Talks about the outer settings, the inner settings, the bridging factors, and that's where as TTCs we really lie as these kind of purveyors or intermediaries that Heather talked about a little bit during our last session. There are a whole host, we could go into a whole host of different models, but these two really focus on that context piece pretty fully. So let's go to the next slide and drive in a little bit deeper into how these contextual considerations can be integrated into our work as TTCs. And as I said, Molly already dug into this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation. But most of our work, at least day to day, focuses at the individual or the team level, right? We do workforce development focused on supporting knowledge gains and skill development, but we really can't separate that individual level work from the context in which people are embedded, right? There's inner and outer settings, as the CFR talks about, the intervention characteristics and so on and so forth, all interact. And we can think about it, you'll see on the next slide, about all these factors in terms of, let's advance the slide if we can. There we go, awesome, thank you. Barriers and facilitators that actually either inhibit or promote the uptake of different kinds of interventions or strategies that we might be trying to implement. So at the systems level, we have certain barriers. We might have financing constraints. We might have certain mandates that need to be followed, unsupportive community cultures or values, political concerns or constraints might serve as barriers. At the organization level, some of these we've already discussed, lack of resources, unsupported leadership, an organizational culture or a climate that's resistant to change. At the individual level, this is where we focus a lot of our efforts, knowledge and skills of the workforce, resistance to change of individuals, just like we might see resistance to change at the organization level. The next slide, we're a little bit more positive. We look at facilitators. Some might argue these are just a different side of the same coin. In some cases, that's true. In some cases, there are unique sets of facilitators versus barriers. But things that can facilitate implementation at the system level, available funding, political priorities. Those of you that have a background in political science, you know, there's agenda setting and whatnot. There are times that are ripe for things to be pushed. And that can help facilitate change and help facilitate the uptake of evidence-based practices and strategies. Public demand. At the organization level, again, we come back to organizational culture and climate, supportive leadership, having a well-resourced organization, back to the Mr. Rogers example. You know, it's easier to do the work when you are well-resourced. It's not easy, but it's easier. Individual level facilitators, having a motivated workforce, people who are open to change, having skilled practitioners who are knowledgeable and have the skills necessary to implement what it is we're trying to implement. So my last slide, let's go to the next slide, just to tie some of this together. And a lot of this overlaps with things we've already talked about today. But how can the TTCs incorporate context into our work? A few ideas: choosing topics, which we've already discussed. Is implementation realistic in light of the barriers and facilitators? What level of support is needed for successful implementation? And oftentimes we see that that's going to be influenced by the members of the audience. Some are going to need more or less support. Targeting a particular audience, who needs to be in the room. And again, we've already had examples today. We're going to focus on practitioners, supervisors, administrators, a combination of all of the above, who will benefit most from that training and technical assistance. Speakers, who are we going to bring in to speak? Who can connect with a particular target audience? In the Northwest MHTTC, we've seen some of our data. We find a host of factors that influence the degree to which people are using information gathered that they're gathering from our trainings. But the number one predictor that we keep seeing over and over and over are perceptions of quality. So by having engaging speakers who can really connect with that audience, people are more motivated to take that information and actually implement different strategies over time. And then finally, designing an evaluation. We'll come back to this in our next session, which will really focus on evaluation, but thinking about context can really help us design what it is we're going to measure when we're doing our evaluations as well. I'm not going to say much on that because I'll hit that again in session 3. But let me pause here. I think we're going to see if we have any time for questions. I think let's move into the next session. We'll take questions after that. Let's go back to Joni right now because we're running just a few minutes behind. And then we'll pause after that section for some questions, if that sounds good to everybody.
Great, thank you. So we, through those initial discussions and our initial meetings with both staff and administrators or leaders within the organization, we identified some facilitators and barriers. as Jonathan mentioned, skilled staff. Many of the clinical supervisors were licensed. They had a clinical license. Motivational interviewing was a skill that many of them have developed throughout their tenure with their organizations and in their careers. Administrators identified that there was a fairly recent motivational interviewing training. So many of the organizations that we worked with had fairly recent MI training. Maybe it was more of just a couple of webinars. One organization had a pretty extensive training. So that was certainly a facilitator. At the individual level, the barriers at the individual level, we really didn't identify any at the time. When we think about the organization and the barriers at the organizational level, I guess it could be perceived as maybe more individual level, but staff time. When we met with staff, direct service staff and clinical supervisors really emphasized that they didn't know how they would include the trainings and the ongoing community of practice and other evaluation requests that we were making of them, how that they would fill that in their work schedule. So that was certainly a barrier at the organization level. Facilitators at the organizational level, the leadership in all of the organizations were very committed, very interested. They had a high level of readiness based on our discussions, based on their responses to some of those questions, based on some of those ongoing meetings that we had with them initially. And administrators were very committed and understood the value of having motivational interviewing implemented within all parts of their organization. There was even one agency leader who identified kind of a blueprint or a way that he wanted to introduce and begin some training around motivational interviewing for some of his support staff. So the receptionists, so that when they're interacting with individuals coming in for services and so on. So there was really a need and an interest in incorporating it throughout the entire agency. So systems level, we started in 2019, the project, and COVID, of course, you know, happened 2020. So our kind of initial plan needed to be reworked and reorganized to include more of the online and remote tools. We actually, as a way to continue to engage staff, we actually held several sessions with both clinical supervisors and the main trainer who worked directly with the clinical supervisors, and with direct service staff and the main trainer who worked with direct service staff. And I participated as well, kind of setting the motivational interviewing aside for a bit and really being there to support them in some of the challenges that they were currently experiencing. And I think that kind of engagement and that the barrier of COVID actually, I think, helped us in terms of our relationship building with the organizations. They saw that we were there during this time of struggle, during this time of support need, and we provided that support. So those barriers were addressed throughout, and we were able to continue to finish the project in a virtual setting. And again, the barriers organizationally, that staff turnover really was a problem pre-COVID, and certainly an even bigger challenge after COVID.
Thanks, Joni.
Yep.
Thank you. Next slide. So be thinking about in the back of your mind those barriers and facilitators that Joni was talking about. And let's move to the, this is our third kind of didactic piece today, to talk about implementation strategies. So that's the, you know, fancy D&I word for TA activities, the things that we do every single day as TTCs. All the trainings, all the technical assistance we provide, the learning collaboratives, learning communities, the online sessions, the webinars, et cetera, et cetera. So in D&I speak, right, these implementation strategies are the activities and actions and causal agents that we do to try to scale up, scale out, and sustain EBPs. So scale up, if you're not familiar with that term, refers to expanding an EBP to similar settings. Scale out means expanding the evidence-based practice to different kinds of settings or subpopulations. And so the question is, how do you choose? How do you choose when you're designing a TA? You know, someone comes to you with a topic, or the state wants you to do some TA. How do you decide which implementation strategies? How do you decide whether to do a training or a TA or a learning collaborative or a project echo or whatever it is? How do you decide that? So we want to think about a couple different lenses maybe to look at when you're deciding. So we could think about what level of TA is appropriate. So, you know, in our first session, John talked us through the 3 levels of TA. So basic, targeted, and intensive. So you could think about what level of TA might be appropriate. And then let's talk a little bit about more in depth about how you match strategies to stage or match to barriers and facilitators. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you, Felicia. So first, let's talk a little bit more about what are the categories or types of implementation strategies or TA activities. So there's been a lot of work in D&I science to try to create a categorization to, you know, document all the different strategies there are. So there's different lists. There's like 73 strategies, or there's 65 strategies, or they all get put together different ways. This is a basic categorization by Byron Powell and colleagues, where they try to fit the implementation strategies, the possible ones, into 6 different categories. And as you look over examples, you can, you know, some of these are things that we do every day. Some of these are things that TTCs don't necessarily take on, but might be things that we would recommend to agencies. You know, we might not be able to alter incentives for providing different types of services, but that is a strategy that might be used. So these are the different types of strategies. And then next slide. That idea again about how to choose. And I think that most often in the universe of change projects, this decision process isn't really a decision process. So here are some strategies that we're going to say are imprecise. So there's the train and pray approach. We talked about that later, where, you know, I think a lot of people's first kind of gut reaction to, hey, we want to implement a new evidence-based practice, we need to train people. And they think like, that's what we need to do. So that train and pray approach, we need to stop thinking that way, right? Let's be a little more strategic about it. The kitchen sink approach is like, let's just, you know, do everything that we have in our arsenal, you know, in our handbag or in our, you know, repertoire. So we'll just do all of it. We'll do a training, and then we'll do audit and feedback, and then we'll do a learning collaborative, and then, you know, we'll follow it up with this and that. The one size fits all approach we often use sometimes, like, hey, we really know how to do learning, you know, communities really well. Let's just do that because we know how to do it. When that might work for some issues, problems, or projects, but might not be what's needed in a given situation. And then the is the diet, it seemed like a good idea at the time, approach is another one. So all of these very imprecise, very like, let's, you know, throw something on the wall and see what sticks kind of things. And next slide, what we want to do is change that thinking and be more precise. So we want to talk about tailoring our implementation strategies, our TA activities. And so there's a couple different ways that we could think about doing that. So let's go to the next slide. So we can select strategies based on stage of implementation. So here again is our EPIS model, and you can think about different implementation strategies being appropriate and fitting with different parts of the EPIS, different stages of implementation. So, you know, exploration, not the time to do training, but exploration is a time to form an implementation team, to identify the problem, do a needs assessment. Preparation is primarily where you want to do the education and training of staff and stakeholders. versus when you're in implementation, that's the time to be monitoring fidelity. So you don't start off with fidelity, that comes later. So to think about where the providers are, or where the community agency is, or the community coalition is in the stage of implementation, and then let's match our strategies based on stage. Next slide. This is an example of an implementation study that used the concept of EPIS and looked at what strategies were actually used. This was a project that was implementing a client-facing web-based shared decision-making system into mental health clinics. So these are the things that they actually did during each of the stages, which kind of, I think, mimics the slide before about the EPIS. So training happens during preparation, right? And when you're in launch is when you have gone live. There's different things you do when you're in the monitoring and sustaining place. Next slide. So another way to think about and plan, decide which TA strategies you're going to use, or implementation strategies you're going to use, is to select them based on the facilitators and barriers that are actually happening within the agencies or clinics or community that you're looking at. And so there's been a little bit of work trying to do that matching. So here we see some examples. If there's a lack of knowledge and you've identified that as a barrier, then you want to do interactive education sessions or training. But sometimes the issues are not all knowledge, right? Sometimes, like if it's a lack of motivation, the staff aren't interested in doing something different, or there are other factors, not just that they're not interested, but there are other barriers. Maybe it's time to do incentives or have the agencies do an incentive. Maybe the problem is really about workflow. They know the new evidence-based practice, but they can't figure out how to get it into their actual routine. And so then a process redesign as an implementation strategy would make more sense. Next slide. And then here's an example of a study. Again, this was looking at a re-engaging veterans project. They were trying to re-engage veterans who had been lost to care and who had serious mental illness. So this was a study where they did what's called an adaptive implementation trial. They're trying to understand like how much implementation support is needed, which is an interesting question to think about if you think about projects you've been involved with, where probably you've done some training or TA and you get to the end and you're like, wow, a few of the agencies really did well. They like jumped in, they're doing whatever the evidence-based practice is. And then maybe there's some that haven't, that maybe need some more of a push. And they might need different implementation strategies. So this is an example where they had kind of the standard set of implementation strategies, a manual, some training, some TA, and then they had an enhanced group that got all these other pieces. And so there's, within D&I science, there's different ways of studying that. And some trials are really like starting with the standard. So everyone gets the standard. And then they see at the end of that, they kind of take a temperature of the agencies and think about like, okay, some of them have jumped in, they're early adopters, they've made changes. Some of them haven't. So what enhanced or other TA can we give them just for those agencies that haven't kind of caught up yet? So that's an example of not using the one size fits all approach, right? But really trying to tailor and target the TA that we're providing to these particular situations. Next slide. Let's stop for just a second to see if there's any questions, comments. We're about to go out into a breakout room, but I just wanted to, are there any questions or comments about the content thus far? Okay, great. Scott, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So we're going back to Joni's example. We're going to send everybody into breakouts again. And if the leader timekeeper, we have, I'm going to put a link in the chat that will take you to this slide on a Google Doc so you can bring it up and share your screen so you all can follow along. And then again, if somebody volunteered to be a report out person. But looking at what Joni mentioned as barriers and facilitators, for their MI project, what implementation strategies, TA activities would you use? So let this be kind of the focus of your discussion. We're a little behind, but I think we can squeak this in. So we'll do another 10 minutes and then come back together. So we'll see you in a few. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good conversation. If you would, in the chat again, just put in some of the things you heard around the implementation strategies. And is there somebody that'd be willing to just share a little bit of what your conversation was like, what you heard?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Mordecai Dixon. I'm with MHTTC in Region 6, one of Molly's colleagues. And
Great. Thank you, Mordecai.
what we talked about actually in terms of the staff timing issues was just kind of reconsidering, maybe even repurposing time, reconsidering the way time is currently used in the organization, meaning maybe taking pre-established meetings and using those to get people involved in changing an agenda item, say, for example, which dedicates itself to the innovation and or the new project, but doesn't make people feel as if it's yet another administrative task. It's already built into something that's pre-existing. It's a standing meeting, say, for example, something to that effect. And then getting that leadership commitment to really speak to the larger agenda, which means that leadership may turn these meetings and repurpose these meetings, just basically saying this is so important that we are going to move in this direction and we're going to do some shifting of priority, so to speak. And that may mean, in some cases, if you have the capacity to have certain staff members step in while those other folks are working the new project. So if you have a potential lead worker or someone who's coming up and coming who can stand in the stead of someone who's going to be working on a project as it's coming on board, they may be an asset to the team, opposed to everyone once again feeling overwhelmed by not being able to do all the work at the same time, which is a realistic thing. As it pertains to staff, we talked about, everything from mutual selection. Do folks fully understand who we are before they join our organization and we hire them? Do we have mutual selection of our values? And if MI is part of the work we do, then that's absorbed into everything from how you got hired to orientation, the whole onboarding process. So it's not a surprise, and training is not just a mere intervention that has no feet and is not practical when you go back to work and you're not doing it for some reason, whether that's a supervisor who doesn't believe in what you're doing or some other barrier. It is high level, but pretty much what we've got to.
Excellent points. Thank you so much, Mordecai. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Heather made a good note. Those of you who were doing the report out, put those nuggets in the chat. We want to compile all those. Appreciate it if you could do that. We're going to keep moving. I'll hand it back to Joni right now. Thank you all.
So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we used. As I mentioned, we met initially with staff, had those initial discussions. We developed an implementation plan, and part of the plan really was a pretty comprehensive plan that we met one-on-one with the agency lead, and the plan identified some of the responsibilities of the agency, the objectives, goals of the implementation, what were our MHTTC responsibilities, and what were some of the outcomes that we would be measuring for success. Just one example of part of that plan was our ongoing learning community would be virtual. And one of the kind of expectations of the agency was to provide cameras and tech support for staff so that they can be part of the learning community, have their cameras on. We would as part of the MHTTC, outlined specific kind of instructions of how to use the Zoom platform so that staff were familiar with what to do prior to engaging in the learning community. And so that was just kind of an example of what the implementation plan looked like. The training and educating of staff implementation strategy was really about in-person training. So at the time, we were able to provide in-person trainings for clinical supervisors. We had a dedicated trainer for clinical supervisors. We also, who was previously a MINT, and also did work around supervision. And then we also had a trainer who was, again, experienced and skilled in MI, working with direct service staff. And we had a virtual training for administrators with a leader who was, again, skilled and in leadership roles in his past, to kind of, again, keep that engagement going and that kind of shared understanding. You can go on to the next slide. We have some other examples. We also had every other month, or every twice a month coaching calls. So each group had calls and spoke with the trainer and kind of strategized. And these were done on Zoom, coaching sessions in person. So before COVID, we also had kind of an in-person coaching session to apply and help staff, both clinical supervisors and direct service staff, apply the trainings that they've been learning about. We had to have a restart training after the pandemic. So we restarted and had a virtual 3-hour training just to orient new staff, get a, kind of even orient or reorient existing staff to just back to MI and again, offer support. And the ongoing communities of practice were both administrators. They met, I believe, once a month with our administrator. And then we had final discussions, which were about the implementation part of it. How do you anticipate and implementing this? What are some existing challenges that you think you might face to implement the training and the skills that you learned throughout the initiative? And we had one session with each group, so clinical supervisors, direct service staff, and administrators. So that was really helpful for them to come back with that, with some concrete ways that they would implement and sustain the initiative. And part of that sustainment was introducing a training of trainers. So those organizations participating in this intensive TA were invited to identify staff to be part of another intensive TA project, which was a training of trainers. So I think that might be my time for this piece.
Great. Thank you so much, Joni, for continuing to share your experiences with implementation. So just as a summary, our session 1 was really around what implementation science is. Now we've finished up session 2 on the rollout and how we decide what to do. So we talked a little bit about readiness, how to know if organizations are ready to adopt and implement a new practice. We talked a bit about the context, what some of those facilitators and barriers might be to implementation, and some strategies on deciding what implementation or strategies to use. So our next session on June 27th will be a working session around how we put what we've learned into practice. So we'll spend some time on evaluation and thinking about how we can use that strategy to help inform our work. And we have a template that we'll be sharing with you for developing TA projects that change practice. So we'd love to hear from you around how the session went. We'll do again a quick plus delta now here at the end. And so I think Felicia will be able to launch a little poll everywhere for us so that we can get a little bit of feedback from you in terms of what worked and what you'd like to see different for next session. We did hear that you wanted more peer time. We tried to put that into this session. So please do let us know what might work for you in our next session 3. So Felicia, are you able to run that poll everywhere for
Yes,
us?
I am. I just dropped a link in the chat for people to go to, and then now I'm going to share screen with the poll, just switching from slides. Bear with me 1 second. Here we go. Here you should see it pop up. You guys see the poll?
Yes, thank you. Great. So thinking through some of those strategies to address barriers, hearing from others, having a person from the MHTTC to be in the breakout rooms and having the slides ahead of time. Yes, we heard about that too. So we made sure to send that out with you earlier, and that mixture of large group and small group discussion. Noting that it might be helpful to have some larger breakout groups. We do know that the timing, we tend to see kind of a drop off at the hour. And so we're trying our best to try to make sure groups are bigger so that when there are people that have to get off on the hour, that they still are a good size group for conversation. Great. Thanks for that feedback. And can we go on to the next one? Felicia, what would you suggest that we change for the next session? And that will be our last session. So we, our team, our internal planning team does have a debrief session. So we do really take a look at your feedback and want to know what you think would help improve our session. So please do share anything that you would like us to consider.
Not sure on my end how to move the question forward.
Oh, okay. Thanks for noting that, Molly. Okay, so it sounds like you got to move the question forward.
Do we need a different?
Or maybe you need to, Felicia, you.
Yeah, let's do the second one. Activate, present, see if that works.
Maybe if I.
Mine is still on. What do you like most about today's session?
Oh, I think somebody
was able to do it. Great.
Yeah.
So shorter time. All right. And if you want to email any one of us as presenters, feel free to send us that feedback, or if you want to private message me on the chat, feel free to put that in there and I'll make sure to bring it back to the group. So thank you again. Appreciate all of your involvement and engagement on this second session. And I loved hearing about your dream jobs too. So anyway, we'll look forward to session number 3 and seeing you again then. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you to the team for sharing all of your knowledge and experience too.
Thanks, everyone.